Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I have Bjorn Ovick with me today from GM of Skyflow. It's a up-and-coming startup in the data privacy space. Bjorn worked for many years in the financial industry for Visa, PayPal, and others. So I'm super happy to have you on the podcast, Bjorn.
Great. Excited to be here and talk with you today.
Great. Let's jump right into interesting stuff. I want to talk about data privacy and how it relates to data initiatives, LLMs, and enterprise implementations. Where do most companies still get privacy wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you look at privacy, the important really around protecting customer data. And there's all different types of customer data ranging from, first name, last name, home address, mobile number, and so on, but it extends beyond that. There's other types of data such as your payment credentials, whether it's a bank account number or a credit card number. And then you move into healthcare data, which is a different type of data sets out there. And when you look at companies, a lot of them think that, hey, I'm locking my data down by encrypting it in a database and putting it away and those things, which is good, but it kind of defeats the purpose around privacy because you still need to access that customer data, access it for things like reporting, things like different workflows, whether you're onboarding a new customer, sharing that data externally with third parties. And that's where a lot of companies are missing the boat because you also need to have strong data governance in place around who can access the data, when they can access the data, and also limiting the type of data and the format that data can be accessed in, whether it's in the clear, my full government ID, or maybe just the last four of the government ID to authenticate a customer. And that's where a lot of things are falling apart is from the data governance perspective and ensuring that that data is not only locked away, but then you have those access controls from a fine-grained perspective to give the right user the right data at the right time. And that's where a lot of companies are missing the boat.
Right, because everyone talks about privacy by design, which sounds nice, but what does it actually mean when building systems, right? There's sometimes a disconnect between legal teams, engineering, compliance teams, some ready-made applications. How do you see this privacy by design evolving when building new systems?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're building new systems from scratch, you're in a really good spot. What we're seeing is a lot of legacy businesses trying to adapt and enhance and strengthen their privacy posture. When you're building it from scratch, some of the best practices that we promote and that we create is around four things actually. One is isolating sensitive data. So capturing that sensitive data, the privacy data early on in your workflow, and then locking that away inside of what we call a vault, and then proliferating and providing tokens throughout the rest of your infrastructure. So you still have reference to that sensitive data, but it's in a tokenized format. I always use the case of somebody gets into the castle, a bad guy gets into the castle, but the crown jewels are still locked away. Same thing when you look at security and privacy. If a bad actor gets inside of the infrastructure, all they have access to are the tokens in the sensitive data. The customer data is locked away in the vault, similar to the crown jewels. So that's number one. Number two then is you can still add in the capability around data governance to access that data. So again, who has access to the crown jewels? When do they have access to it? And all those things for them to perform their function, perform their duty, whether it's running reports, sharing that data, or providing customer service. So if you're building from the scratch and you want to build this in from a privacy by design perspective, those are some of the critical elements. Locking the data away, tokenizing that data so you still have access to it, and then governing access controls.
Right. It's interesting. I saw your colleagues at the Databricks conference in San Francisco recently, and I didn't know that you were also active in that space, like working directly with the platforms, because that's always a good idea when building new systems. How to do this, and how do these vaults impact developers in terms of speed for delivering such solutions, friction? We've got a chance to work on a POC together with your teams. And it's interesting because in Europe, we use this pseudonymization approach. Tokenization is becoming more and more important to think from scratch, but also so are modern data platforms where some of this work gets developed. How do you see this evolving in terms of developer impact and practical implementation process?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, fundamentally, when you look at, platforms which are super powerful like Databricks or Snowflakes or, the other BI platforms out there, they provide a great function. Fundamentally, though, does Databricks or Snowflake actually need my customer social security number to perform the analysis and what they're trying to accomplish? And 99.9% of the time, the answer is no, they do not need my customer social security number. So getting back to the whole isolation of that sensitive data and providing tokens back into the various workflows and systems, whether they're internal or external tools that you're using, such as Databricks. Again, you're reducing your scope of potential vulnerabilities to that sensitive data. So that's one that is super fundamental. Number two, though, is if after Databricks runs its analysis or Snowflake does and those things, and let's say it's a marketing analysis, and now they want to go and email this subset of 100,000 customers that I do have. Again, Databricks and Snowflake do not need to have the actual email address there. Instead, you can lock it away in the vault. Marketing can still access those email addresses by using those tokens. And again, through workflows, being able to share the email addresses, maybe with my email provider, SendGrid or whoever it may be, out mass messages with Twilio, but being able to share that data or send that data to my third-party service provider to actually execute and send those messages off. Again, all this is built in using those third-party applications when you build privacy by design from the start.
Yep. No, absolutely. One of the interesting things is now the requirements to protect that data. I mean, this is all of a sudden getting more complex and more complex. I mean, the question is true global privacy compliance, even in the context of let's say a financial institution that is, working in multiple jurisdictions, is that even possible? And to what degree can you ensure that unless you take these deep technological measures that are basically the same technology solution across the board? And so make sure that you're basically doing the best you possibly can, regardless of the jurisdiction.
Yep, absolutely. And that's even more important now with the, with LLMs. And if you're a global financial institution or global company, and you want to take advantage of the power of the LLMs and start testing and learning and seeing what you can do there, what do you do with your customer data, right? And making sure that depending on the jurisdiction, the country and those things, that the LLM is following the right guidelines and restrictions from a privacy regulatory standpoint. What we do there is we promote don't put sensitive data in an LLM. And it's quite simple. Instead of using somebody's first name, last name, you tokenize that before it goes into the LLM. So the LLM never has my customer data. There's no delete button on an LLM. Once the data's in there, it's gone. So when you look at privacy regulations, a big one is right to be forgotten, meaning that as a customer, I can go to the company that has my sensitive information and say, I want you to get rid of that and dump that. How do you do that in LLM? You can't. So again, building this and designing this correctly from a privacy first perspective, never put that data in there. Instead, tokenize it. Another example with right to be forgotten is I have somebody's sensitive information spread throughout my system. We talked to this global bank and they had customer data sitting in 753 different applications and systems inside of their bank.
Right.
How do I go and delete my customer information? It's very difficult to do. Where if you build it out privacy by design and have tokens there, you go into the vault, you delete the customer record there. Tokens are useless throughout the 751 systems then. I've now gone to one source, deleted the customer record, and taken care of it. So again, some things to think about from a privacy regulatory standpoint. The other one is all around data sovereignty. GDPR has this, India has this, Indonesia has this, and so on, where data literally needs to sit on So when you look at the different privacy regulations that different countries are popping up around the world, where Europe led the charge, I think, with GDPR. You have DPDP in India, which is coming. They also have RBI around a payment perspective. Indonesia just launched some new data privacy regulations, Australia and so on. There are a few common requirements when you look at those. One of them is simply data residency, meaning that my customer data needs to sit in country or in region. And Skyflow is working with a lot of multinational companies to solve that. What we'll do is set up vaults in each one of those countries to protect the data and have it reside in country. So again, the whole thought of capturing the data early on in the customer journey, locking it in the vault. In this case, if it's a European citizen or somebody that lives in Europe, putting that data in the vault in Frankfurt as an example. Indonesia, it's an Indonesian citizen, you put it in the vault in Indonesia. Now, not only do you have that data protected, it's actually sitting in data sovereignty is there. And then you can put the data governance layer on top of it, which is another important factor when you're looking at these privacy regulations, making sure that they have access to the data, but very controlled access to solve and meet those different requirements.
Right. And it's also following the logic that, was discussed. I remember there are times when we started implementing GDPR in Europe, which feels like ages ago in 2018. The ideal solution is to basically just be able to protect the data. And if you need to be forgotten, you just throw the key away and you can never do anything with it because you just deleted the key, all the kind of the chain of where the data, is used, essentially cut. And that's a good way to implement it. Everyone thought, well, maybe we should do something like this internally and implement it. But then how often do you want to implement it for every relevant data layer or application? I mean, it just doesn't scale if you were to do it on your own, right? And it certainly doesn't scale with what you're saying with the data residency. If you also, on top of that, want to just keep even within the same company for affected regions, you'd have data residing in the region. Even the data that is locked away with the key would be living someplace else. What do you think that does to the way that, like, let's take US for as an example, how US banks handle laws like CCPA or CPRA alongside GDPR?
It's along the same guidelines. There's actually workflow aspect. You look at that regulation. One, it needs to protect it, transit at rest, all of those things, which is important. The bigger factor, though, is around access of who has access to the data, making sure they only have access at the time they need access, which is fundamental for CCP. And those are things, again, that Skyflow does today out of the box. You brought up an interesting point in your comment there of companies wanting to build this, and it's a build versus buy discussion. The way I look at it is if I have an engineering team, a product team, I want them focused on differentiating our platforms, our product, our solutions, and so on, making it better for the customer, and relying on somebody like Skyflow to handle the data privacy aspects with the solution that we deliver from an enterprise grade perspective. This is all we do. This is all we think about. Why not leverage somebody like us instead of trying to build this yourself? And we do it globally. We do it for customers in over 30 countries around the world. We're live on every continent except Antarctica, and we do it well. And more companies, when they do the build versus buy analysis, are finding to come over to Skyflow and let us take care of that for them.
And I think, honestly, I think it's a great approach because we implement projects for customers. And just with shout out to my friend Steven from Tilores, they do, they, for example, only focus on entity resolution and no one does it better than they do, right? But just that particular problem, which if you're a large enterprise implementing a serious project, you encounter that problem, just like you encounter the data privacy problem. And then you have to ask yourself, well, am I really bringing a new vendor in, or I'm just buying the best practice instead of having a team of 5 people struggle for 3 months to implement a subpar solution, right? And so I think the economics definitely pan out in general with such approaches. And that's why I think it's interesting to hear, companies like yours that solve a particular problem set, but solve it in a way and with the focus that no one else does really in that depth, right? And so that's a very different way of thinking of creating software, the way that, let's say, major integration firms or major software development houses or really huge internal teams would think about. They would actually basically try to do everything on their own, unless it's pretty obvious. It's like, okay, for a BI solution, I need a BI tool. I'm not going to be playing. But for these things, there's quite a few challenges in the enterprise that are similar to what you're trying to do. And now the question is, in terms of the privacy stuff, I mean, we still are struggling in Europe with like cloud approvals. How should a team at a global enterprise like a major US bank or a major European bank think about
Yeah, it's a good question. When I'm sitting there, if I'm in a bank and a privacy officer, risk officer, and those things, what are the risks from a cloud perspective, right? And versus having on-prem or having it locked away in your private cloud. And a lot of it is control of your own environment versus a public environment. The risk there is obviously access to sensitive data. And going back to the original discussion that we had around tokenizing data, so if there is a breach, somebody gets in the castle, they don't have access to the crown jewels. And again, by deploying a vault architecture, enables these companies, financial institutions, and more importantly, the privacy and security officers in those banks to have more of a peace of mind that my data is protected as I'm moving into the cloud. I do think that from a economic standpoint, it's more efficient. You have, better scale, better, both vertically and horizontally and all those things. And fundamentally, it should be more cost efficient as well for them to go that route. So, but you have to balance those things out. Protection, customer privacy perspective with the cost of doing business.
So essentially it's a service like for example, Skyflow as a service that, a developer team would utilize. How they integrate that, or what's the way to think about integrating this with like an AI architecture within the context of an AI architecture?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at AI and LLMs in general, is their privacy organizations inside of banks, inside of payment companies, inside of any are very concerned around customer data going into the LLM. I've had multiple conversations with global banks, global payment companies, where their privacy groups and compliance groups have put a stop on their AI initiatives because there's not a strong answer of how is my customers' data, our customer data being protected and making sure we can handle the regulations from an LLM perspective. What we're doing is working with leading organizations to make sure that that sensitive data never goes into the LLM by using a capability that's called Skyflow detect. So when you're training a model or prompting a model, we can go through that information, both structured data as well as unstructured data, and identify sensitive data that's in those data sets before it even hits the LLM. And again, we can tokenize that data. So the LLM still has the data there to do what it needs to do. And we'll tokenize it by saying, first underscore name, token, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the LLM still knows that this is a first name like Karl. Or a date of birth, or an account number, so on. They just don't actually have the actual account number or date of birth or name. So again, by default, you're upholding the privacy regulations by never putting customer data in. So from an engineering perspective, and intercepting the data, both structured and unstructured, before it even lands in an LLM is the way that we're approaching this, and the way that we are working with global organizations to protect the privacy of their customer data when they start working with LLMs and Gen AI. The other important thing, though, is what is the response? So I prompt something, I'm in a customer service chatbot. I don't want to have first name underscore last name come back in that response. So we also have the ability to rehydrate the data with Karl in the response as it comes back in that customer service chatbot. So that's what we're doing there, which is super exciting. And then the third layer on top of that is data residency. So depending on where that customer is prompting, you can actually tokenize that data, put it in the vault in the right region. And then from a governance perspective, rehydrate the data in the response back to the customer, and maybe just show the last 4 of the credit card number instead of the full credit card number, depending on the policy and the data governance policy you set up for them. So it's super powerful stuff. And fundamentally, it gives peace of mind to compliance and your regulatory privacy teams, but it also enables engineers and developers to harness the full power of these LLMs to push the testing and modeling and use cases forward.
I think it's a great approach because for all of these things in recent regulation that came up, I mean, there's like legal people, compliance people, risk management people talking about this. And at the end of the day, there's a developer team sitting there thinking, okay, what does that mean for us? What are we like? Is there an API for that? What are you guys talking about? And this is kind of that approach, right? If that's like the technological solution for it, then they can go ahead. It's incumbent upon them to explain why that covers the regulations and not the other way around. The development team is explaining how they're covering regulations. They don't really understand or need to understand really. So that I would encourage everyone from my listeners to have a look at Skyflow and consider that approach in general. I mean, if you guys believe you can implement this on your own, that's a great, and you want to pay for it, then go for it. What are some real world lessons that you want to share in terms of projects that were a success? And let's say in the financial industry, that people can understand how the privacy was solved using Skyflow.
Yeah, one example use case that we've really not touched on is just looking at simple customer onboarding. So if I'm a financial institution and I need to onboard a new customer, I need to collect a lot of sensitive personal information about that individual. Not only name, government ID, and all those things, I also need to collect images of passports or IDs or those things. And once I have that data, I need to go through some various regulatory checks as well, such as anti-money laundering check, OFAC check, maybe pull their credit history and those things. So again, I'm taking that sensitive data, privacy data, personal data about an individual, and now I need to share that data with my service providers to run the OFAC and AML checks, to pull their credit history and so on. So again, by using that data, I now need to govern that data and really limit who I'm sending it to and what is the purpose for sending it to them. And all that ties back to the privacy regulations that they also need to uphold. So not only do you have the government regulations to onboard a customer, you also are battling now with the privacy regulations to make sure you're sharing only the data that your downstream service provider needs at that time. And that causes more headaches for engineering teams and development teams of how do I control this really and go that route. So again, Skyflow from a data governance perspective enables you to share that data downstream with third-party API sets in that highly governed fashion and only giving them the data that they need when they need it and so on, which is another interesting use case. Kind of gets back to the whole LLM thing. Only given the data that the LLM needs to perform their function. Same thing here.
Right. Because you can always detokenize it if there's a use case for it, but you wouldn't be just surfing and browsing and sharing data en masse without the necessity for it. And only if there's like a hit or some red flag or whatever, then you go in and actually look at what that is. And so kind of the surface area of exposure is much lower. And that's kind of something that you might argue on individual, projects that would be an overkill if a team again were to implement this internally, because the question is always, okay, that sounds great, but we could do this on our own. Yeah, it's a function. Yeah, it's a function plus
Absolutely.
a bunch of other things plus a bunch of other things, and you better go according to the best practice, right? Which would be to tokenize it and detokenize it only when necessary.
Well, the other important element to think about is when you look at a lot of the breaches happen from internal actors. Whether it's somebody's compromised a customer service rep's username and password and now has access to their customer data, or it's a rogue, actor inside the company that has access to the data from an engineering perspective and steals that data. So again, by locking that data away, whether it's from a service provider or even from your internal employees, only giving them access when they need it, again, you're reducing your blast radius from bad actors, whether it's internal or external.
How would you address the concerns of like, okay, that sounds wonderful, but some others would say, well, that's lock-in or there's like a dependency. What is the portability of a solution like that? Because it's also something that it'll be a question from, you're not evaluating the risk for like losing the data because obviously protected, but then you're evaluating the risk of the third-party provider like Skyflow. Is there something that you could share in terms of what would be an argument against that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. One is data ownership, right? It's who owns the data. Ultimately, and commercially, the way that we approach that is the customer's data. They have access to it at any time. They can pull the data via an API if they need to. So that takes away that concern. The other is relying on a third-party service provider. If you're in the public cloud today or moving to the public cloud, fundamentally you're relying on a third-party service provider, and your vault can actually live inside of that same cloud provider's account itself that you have up there. So again, you control that environment, or it's controlled through your relationship with your cloud provider to do that. So it really removes a lot of those things. The last that I'll touch on is the data can be locked away. Our customers, we have the ability for them to bring their own keys, bring their own key rotation management systems as well. So again, the data is locked away. They manage access control. They manage the keys. We never have access to the data, which removes that concern also. And then finally, from a performance perspective, the proof's in the pudding. We've run multiple POCs with some of the largest organizations in the world just to show that our performance is there, and they can scale with us, and they don't have hesitation once they go through those performance capability assessments.
Right, right, and essentially the that enables, if we're talking about, let's say, implementations, I mean, of new data platforms, that this would be a recommendation to go and have a look at this approach for making sure that you devise your new data platform that you obviously want to use for the next, 7 to 10 years. Really, those are major investments. That you don't try to retrofit privacy in a year, right, or in 2 years, because personal identifiable information will slip through different use cases quicker than you think, and you'd wish that you'd started earlier, right? Or otherwise you just have technical debt to refactor. We certainly have seen horrible GDPR implementations in place that you can say, well, you spent a lot of effort for something that actually is not great, right? So maybe you didn't have better options, maybe you did, but that certainly isn't the way that if you were to do it today, that you would go that route, right? Just both for the deletion and for the identification purposes, but also if we were to use this data for use cases, this just isn't really fit for it. So in the context of data platforms, if you think of something like Databricks, and it has its governance and its functionality, and if, let's say, if you're a financial institution, what would be a recommendation to you to basically utilize Skyflow in the context of Databricks?
Yeah, absolutely. So from a Databricks perspective, again, be careful of what customer data you're putting inside of the Databricks. Does Databricks really need my customer's government ID number to perform its function, or their home address, those types of things for them to perform their function? What we recommend there is using something like Skyflow to tokenize that data before it goes into Databricks. So again, you're reducing who has access to the data, whether it's individuals or systems, from a sensitive data perspective. And that does a couple things. One is it enables you to give you peace of mind that there's one less system that has my customer data. Instead, they have tokens to run performance. Two is it gives you peace of mind because you have data governance. So if somebody actually does need access to that data as an output of what happens in Databricks, they still can do that through something like Skyflow's data governance capability. And then third, from a right to be forgotten, it's one less system you need to worry about from removing data from that system. And then lastly, from a data sovereignty perspective, if you have a Databricks installation running in Europe, but you also have customers in Singapore, you can now ensure that the Singaporean citizen data is living in Singapore, and you can still use Databricks that's installed and running in Europe. So it really hits those four elements from that. And that would be my recommendation.
Great. So I always ask a question similar to, what is like one myth, let's say, in the field of data privacy that you wish would not be here?
Yeah, one big myth, and we see this all the time, is, well, my data is encrypted and at rest, in transit, and all of those things, which is good, but it's not great. And the myth there is really around that they think they've solved everything. And that's not the case when you look at that. Again, you need to ensure that you have the access controls in place and all the other elements that we talked about today. So just encrypting data alone is not enough.
It's not enough. It's definitely not enough. I think many have come to realize that, especially in the regulated industry space, because after a few years of audits here and there, you kind of have to live with the reality of taking better care of your proliferating PII, even in places you think they're governed in the data space. All right. Before we close this down, how can people find you or and Skyflow?
Yeah, absolutely. So the best way is go to skyflow.com. There's information up there. There's demos up there. You can reach out to us through skyflow.com. I'm also obviously up on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me if you want to have a chat as well. Or you can email me at bjorn.ovick@skyflow.com, and we can get you to the right folks on our side to have a conversation. Not only about Skyflow, but more importantly, we're also happy to have and share our expertise of what we're seeing out there globally to help you improve your data protection and privacy posture.
Well, Bjorn, thanks so much for this discussion. I think it's a very necessary talk for some of our clients in the financial industry and other regulated industry space. Yeah, but also for others that are just want to use best practices in terms of data protection. I mean, retail chains, everyone else that really is handling customer data. Cheers to you in San Francisco from here in Vienna, Austria, and hope to talk to you soon. Cheers.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.